Absolutely. And when you're looking at corporate media, of course, it always starts with the rockets and then, of course, the unequivocal declaration that Israel has the right to self-defense. You absolutely never hear about what precedes such rockets. And you absolutely never hear about the context, the overall analysis of, the historical context that preceded all of this, right? And that continues to be ongoing. As you mentioned, Sheikh Jarrah, which is a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, mobs of extremist settlers that are armed, mind you, have been expelling Palestinians out of their homes that they've had for generations in this neighborhood. We've all seen the videos. They are very harrowing and horrifying. People being thrown out of their homes by force, all of their material objects being thrown violently out of their homes. You have settlers who are obviously from America in the yards of Palestinians saying, if I don't take this home, someone else will, so I have to take it. This neighborhood has been under assault for quite some time. These settlers have just been waiting for what they deem as a mandate from the Israeli courts that they've been fighting for decades to try to seize and expel these Palestinians from East Jerusalem. Now, I think the important context to this also is that East Jerusalem, just like the West Bank, is under brutal Israeli martial law. Military law forbids Palestinians from protesting, convening in groups of 10 or more, raising a Palestinian flag. All of these things are illegal under martial law. And so it is very brave that Palestinians are protesting, let alone resisting in the ways that we're seeing now. So, of course, Sheikh Jarrah was violently mobbed by these settlers, thousands strong, chanting death to Arabs and burn their memories. Palestinians peacefully resisted these mobs of violent settler attacks. And of course, soldiers showed up to brutalize them and violently suppress the protests. And of course, all the Israeli soldiers stand on the side of the settlers. Now then, you have worshippers, hundreds of worshippers in Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is the third holiest site in Islam, stationed in Jerusalem, praying during Ramadan. And then you had IDF soldiers storm the mosque, launch stun grenades and smoke bombs inside, tear gas as well, inside of the mosque, sent hundreds of worshippers to the hospital. This is a war crime, right? This is a war crime that what they did was actually tear gas and launch smoke bombs inside of the hospital after the worshippers were sent there. And then you saw harrowing footage of thousands of extremist settlers chanting, burn their memory again, erase their names outside of the burning Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is a mosque that is ancient. It's 100 years older than the Notre Dame Cathedral. All of the historians were in mass uproar when the Notre Dame Cathedral was burning, and there is quite deafening silence over the intentional burning and attacks on this ancient compound. So all of this preceded the rocket attacks. Hamas, the governing force in Gaza, of course, issued a statement saying, we will retaliate if these attacks continue. And I think Israel made a miscalculation here. I think that they thought that they could violently expel these Palestinians and commit this ethnic cleansing with zero retaliation. And that was a miscalculation on their part because, of course, we saw the rockets fired in response. And Israel, like it always does, issues a wildly disproportionate response, demolishing entire homes with sleeping families inside. And I just want to pose to viewers just this analogy, because I think it's really a stark analogy. Imagine a mob of armed Muslim extremists storming an ancient synagogue, chanting death to Jews. How do you think the media would respond to that? Or how about this? Imagine, let's say, a mob of Trump supporters that all were armed with weapons in an immigrant community in Texas, storming through the immigrant community, seizing people's homes and occupying them, violently throwing out the immigrants on the street. I can't imagine how liberal media would cover such a situation. So it really just shows you the extreme hypocrisy when it comes to media coverage of what's happening in occupied Palestine. And Israel itself is a state that is founded on top of indigenous land. It's an ongoing settler colonial project that has been continuing for 73 years. And every single day we see the settler colonial project continue to expand, continuing to annex the entire West Bank, continuing to throw people out of their homes in a violent fashion, and continuing to kill and imprison anyone that resists. And I think this can all be summed up by something that's in place in East Jerusalem, which is called the demographic law, which essentially says that there needs to be a 70% majority Jewish population in East Jerusalem. So what does that mean? What does that mean if the percentage goes above 30%? Well, it means that you need to kick those people out, right, and commit ethnic cleansing to keep that artificial majority of the Jewish population. And essentially, that is what the foundation of Zionism is. It's an artificial majority that's imposed violently. And it means that in order to keep that majority, you need to expel or kill the indigenous population that is threatening that majority. This is a apartheid regime. This is a genocidal colonial occupation. And it's just quite fascinating that it's somehow been able to shroud itself in the notion that it's a progressive state and a democracy. It's quite the opposite. And you even see like founders of the state of Israel. I mean, the first prime minister, Ben Gurion, when you look at what his statements were during the foundation of Israel, he says, you know, we must expel the Arabs and take their places. This was an explicitly articulated sentiment across pretty much every leader of Israel, no matter how progressive the United States depicts them. I mean, look at Levi Eshkol during the 1967 war. He said, if we don't give them enough water, maybe their orchards will wither and yellow. And I think that that's a policy that they've obviously continued in place in Gaza, where people do not have clean, potable water and haven't for some time. It's a completely untenable situation. It's unlivable. And it's atrocious that people who call themselves progressive can actually bend over backwards and make the mental gymnastics to excuse this and somehow pretend that you can be progressive, except for the case of Palestine. So the fact that liberal Zionists, they just kind of want to believe that they are progressive, but at the same time, they have to accept the reality of what Israel is. And they have to accept the reality of it's an exclusively Jewish state. What does that mean for the Arabs and the Palestinian population that live there? What's really the reality there is that there's this current of genocidal bloodlust throughout Israeli society. You can see this reflected in poll after poll. You can see it reflected in just the results of the elections, right? The vast majority of Israelis support the Likud government. They support Netanyahu. They support the ethnic cleansing. They support the ongoing massacres and atrocities carried out in Gaza. They support the ongoing occupation. And this is liberal Zionists as well. You see 80 to 95% support for things like the carpet bombing of Gaza in 2014, for things like the shoot to kill orders during the Great March of Return a couple of years ago in 2018. So these things are quite starkly reflected and quite obviously so. Of course, it's just not reported as such. When we were there in Jerusalem, which is supposed to be this very liberal safe haven for LGBTQ friendly people, there's gay bars, and it pretty much just feels like you're in like somewhere in America, right? A bustling city. Well, we just picked random people from all walks of life. We didn't cherry pick any of these interviews, and we got very honest answers of what people just simply think about the situation. We left it a very open-ended question and let people speak for themselves. What I found interesting about it was, A, what would these people say when the camera isn't on? You know, the fact that they were very, very just kind of leapt into this rhetoric that was nothing short of genocidal was very alarming. And they knew that they were on camera, right? They knew that they were speaking to a Western audience, and they were completely unabashed with these kind of sociopathic viewpoints about what should be done with Palestinians and Arabs. So the people who didn't say, you know, obliterate them, kill them, bomb them into oblivion, said things like they should all be kicked out, right? Or we should give them a state so then we can actually have a war and drop one big bomb and that's it. One other person that I found, you know, it was really disturbing. He said, we have the right to hate them. We should have the right to hate them. You had a young 17-year-old girl or so who looked like she was just, you know, a cute little cheerleader, basically giggling and saying, death to all Arabs. So this is something that is extremely common. I think that in order to be an Israeli living within 48, you need to condone this behavior to a certain extent. You need to be okay. You need to be brainwashed to the point that you actually are okay with the ongoing colonization, right? The ongoing apartheid regime that denies 5 million people their basic human rights. And I think the Israelis that are truly left-wing leave. They flee. I mean, people who are anti-Zionist, they can't stay in a Zionist settler colonial state. So a lot of these people have passports for other places in Europe, and they just leave because they can't exist in such a fascistic, racist society that is just committing these atrocities against other people. And so that's why you have the liberal Zionists living comfortably there, and they just tell themselves that this is all necessary for their security and safety. And you even saw people who called themselves liberal Zionists and leftists tell us on camera they want a more humane occupation. That's the liberal Zionist viewpoint, is the occupation is important, but it should be more humane. That's really at its core what Israel is. It was founded on this kind of racist colonization that still continues, and they've masked it in something else entirely, but at its core, from the very foundation of Israel, that's exactly what it has been. And, you know, as I mentioned, this has been articulated by pretty much every ruler of Israel since the foundation. The Nakba was an extremely horrific event. We're coming up on the 73rd year anniversary of the Nakba this weekend, and there's going to be solidarity actions all around the world. But the Nakba is particularly important because, you know, the 500 villages that were razed, a lot of these people were expelled into refugee camps, not only in Palestine, but in neighboring countries. You know, that's why a lot of the people actually fled to Gaza. And that's why 75% of people in Gaza are refugees from neighboring lands that they were ethnically cleansed from, right outside of this artificial border. And it's just a really horrific situation. I mean, the fact that generation upon generation, these refugees have just been left. And Israel has just been standing in flagrant violation of international law, because after the Nakba, after the catastrophe, the UN declared that Palestinians have the right to return. That's why Palestinians are seen holding the key. The key is a very symbolic image for them, because they believe that they have the right to return. Millions of Palestinians do have the right to return under international law to these homes. When we spoke to Ahmed Abu Artema, the lead organizer of the Great March of Return, he said the intent of the Great March was to kind of show the international community, you know, mount this peaceful occupation in tents and encampments to show the international community that they are still refugees, to bring attention to their plight as refugees, and say, hey, 70 years later, we're still refugees without a home. And we still have nowhere to go, and we're still being treated like animals. And it was meant to just be a symbolic gesture, and of course we all know what happened next, which is they were met with sniper fire. Hundreds were massacred in cold blood for simply peacefully resisting. And it really shows you that it doesn't matter what they do. It doesn't matter if they're peaceful or armed or anything. Israel will react in the exact same way, and they've even gone as far as criminalizing peaceful resistance and activism outside of Palestine, which is why you see all of these anti-BDS measures in 30 or so states here in the US. But yes, I think from its very core, Israel is a racist, colonizing entity, and it continues to be so. And especially during the Trump administration, Trump's allegiance and alliance with Netanyahu really kind of exposed and unmasked this as well, because liberals bend over backwards trying to excuse Israel for everything it does, claiming that, okay, it's the only democracy in the Middle East and we need to protect it and this and that. But I think their hatred for Trump caused quite a conundrum, because they couldn't explain away why Netanyahu loved Trump so much. And in fact, he was using Trump for his re-election campaign. There was giant banners unfurled of Trump shaking hands with Netanyahu. They named settlements after Trump. Of course, Jared Kushner's family was personally profiting off the settlement expansion, and, you know, had a bedroom for Netanyahu in his New York penthouse. So I think that reign of the Trump administration really did kind of shift the perception of Israel permanently in the eyes of a lot of liberals who realize that this whole notion of being progressive except for Palestine is completely impossible and untenable. And especially with the advent of social media, Israel cannot control the narrative anymore. This is how they basically manipulated the masses for so long, is weaponizing this notion of anti-Semitism and deflecting the fact that any criticism means that you're a racist and a bigot, which is absurd. But since the advent of social media, people are seeing for themselves for the first time the war crimes, the atrocities. You can't cover this up. You can't erase this away. And so every single time Israel goes on the offense and does things like this, more and more people wake up. Mass consciousness is permanently shifting in Palestine's favor. I think that the most stark depiction of apartheid is when you're in, of course, the occupied West Bank. As you mentioned, I mean, there's two tiers of legal systems for Palestinians and Jews. This is, you know, obvious, dozens of laws across the occupied territories that prove this, right? And it's visceral. I mean, you can see it with your own eyes. There are different roads for Israeli settlers. For example, Palestinians only get like a month's supply of water at a time that they can put in a tank above their house, where Israelis and settlers can just set up an outpost to get immediate military protection, electrical wiring, and water lines run throughout their settlements, settlements that are illegal under international law. So it's just day-to-day things things like this that are humiliating, dehumanizing for the Palestinian residents that live there. And of course, the checkpoints that you have to wait hours in line, and Israeli soldiers will just arbitrarily set up just barricades that just make day-to-day life impossible. They want it to be absolutely impossible, and they want these people to leave. I think the most harrowing depiction of apartheid is in a city called Hebron. It was one of the largest Palestinian cities that has been overtaken by Israeli settlers. There's a couple hundred Israeli settlers protected by thousands of Israeli soldiers. The city used to be a bustling hub of commerce, beautiful, historic, ancient sites, and now it's a complete ghost town because the settlers have moved in on top of Palestinian homes and shops and actually caged them in like animals. I'm not exaggerating. They are caged like animals with settlers living on top of their homes. You know, usually in the West Bank, in these villages, they'll move on top of the village in this kind of architecture of oppression. But this is just something totally beyond the pale because they're living on top of them, and they throw their sewage, they throw dirty diapers, they throw garbage, broken glass on top of the Palestinians who live below. Everyone there has a story. I mean, that's something that's really horrifying also once you're traveling there. You know, every Palestinian that you talk to has experienced death and loss and tragedy in just unspeakable ways. And we spoke to one shopkeeper who was living in Hebron, and he said that his wife was 8 months pregnant and she got shot by a settler, and she actually had the baby, and he said the baby's a miracle, and he's so grateful that he was able to keep the baby even though he lost his wife. His daughter was blinded in one eye because of poisonous sewage that was thrown on her by the settlers living above. And while we were speaking to this man, you know, his kids were playing, and there was barbed wire all behind him and just piles of garbage. It's really hard to explain how horrific it is and how this is just allowed. I mean, the effects on daily life, I mean, it's too numerous to even tell, but I will say that let's just think of ambulances. If you need treatment, you cannot get from one place to another because ambulances have to go through these checkpoints. When we were going into the occupied territories for the first time, one of the first things that we saw was actually an ambulance at one of these checkpoints, and they were pulling out the body to check for quote unquote weapons. And I don't know what happened to the person, but I know several people who say that they've lost loved ones because they weren't able to get medical attention in time because of the militarization throughout the West Bank. So it's just things like this that, I mean, apartheid is just so obvious and it's so glaring that you have to ask yourself, how has it taken so long to speak something so obvious? But needless to say, I am very happy that organizations are finally getting on board stating such a clear truth, because now that we can all agree that it's an apartheid state, now we can move forward with what to do about it, and that is mounting international pressure to make the apartheid regime fall. I mean, Gaza is essentially a warehouse for refugees. It is an open-air prison. It's been under a medieval siege by Israel for the last almost 15 years. You had the Israeli military chief right before they actually left Gaza say that they wanted Hamas to take control of the Gaza Strip so that everyone in Gaza could be deemed a hostile entity. And that was actually revealed in a WikiLeaks cable. So Israel wants Hamas to be used as a scapegoat so they could just collectively punish the 2 million residents who live in Gaza. This is an area that's completely partitioned off. It's one of the most densely populated areas in the world, 5 miles by 25 miles long. The people there have no mobility. This is the most fundamental, basic human right, is the freedom of movement. They cannot leave. You cannot go outside without permits authorized by Israel. So, for example, let's say you are diagnosed with breast cancer and you live within the Gaza Strip. Well, you'd be very lucky if you're able to get outside medical treatment. And that's why the survivability for breast cancer rates in Gaza is around 30%. Whereas opposed to if you live, let's say, in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, your chances of survival are 86% for breast cancer. Once we saw the Great March of Return spark off, and of course that did spark off because the situation is completely unlivable. Even the UN said that it's an uninhabitable situation and it would be completely uninhabitable by 2020. Well, it's 2021. So where are we at? Where is the international community when it comes to what is going on in Gaza, where 2 million people are caged like animals, denied water, electricity, freedom to move, and medical attention? What do you think's going to happen? You think these people aren't going to retaliate? When you torture people and push them to the brink, of course they're going to. But of course, Israel will use any sort of retaliation and cloak itself in this self-righteousness of, oh, well, we need to defend ourselves from these rocket attacks that are just indiscriminately fired. Meanwhile, they have targeted munitions that target entire residential neighborhoods and families while they sleep in bed. And you mentioned the death toll is now up to 24 people, 9 children, 9 children. You know, it's just unfathomable and unconscionable what Israel does to collectively punish anyone living in Gaza. And of course, the Great March of Return sparked off, and that's where you saw tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting their caged existence. Ahmed Abu Artema said that he saw birds flying between, you know, Gaza and their ancestral lands, and just said, this is against human nature. The occupation flies in the face of what it is to be human. You know, I mean, I think that really just speaks volumes. And what we're seeing now is just another brutal bombardment of Gaza with no context, of course, being told to us by the corporate media. And this kind of collective punishment is just war crime upon war crime. You know, to target a Hamas member's entire family while they're sleeping in bed is a war crime. And they also, ministers have come out and said that this is not going to stop. I mean, they are going to target many more buildings. You mentioned the Al Sharuk Journalist Tower. This is a journalist tower that housed many international media outlets today that was leveled completely to the ground. And I think it really is important to understand that they know that there are journalists in these buildings. They don't care who is where. Everyone in Gaza is a Hamas target. Because if you live in Gaza, you are blamed for Hamas. It would be as absurd as if another country was bombing civilian targets here in the U.S., orphanages, hospitals, schools, and said, well, you guys elected Trump, right? So therefore, we can blame you for having elected Trump. And we can just indiscriminately bomb you and everyone that you know, and all of these civilian targets and infrastructure, and then use the completely dehumanizing talking points of human shields. Which really, if you look back at history, the U.S. has used the term human shield to dehumanize any enemy that it's trying to wage war against. So this is a tale as old as time. What's stunning to me is that Israel can still get away with it and somehow claim that all of the children it intentionally kills are somehow human shields. It's just really, it's really disgusting. Absolutely. It is really unbelievable, okay? And I think that it all started for me when I saw the Gaza flotilla massacre and the fact that the media was actually trying to portray innocent peace activists on a boat bringing aid to Gaza as violent perpetrators of aggression and justifying the fact that Israeli commandos were jumping on the ship that was in international waters and just executing people. And the fact that the media was actually all on board with the same narrative was pretty stunning and really eye-opening to me, and I just haven't looked back since. You mentioned the Al Sharuk Journalist Tower getting bombed and the media painting it as Hamas's fault. Well, I have to remind people that back in 2012, during Operation Pillar of Defense, Israeli authorities shelled that same journalist tower. They actually blew the leg off of an RT cameraman, my colleague at the time. And when my network asked for a response, a statement of why they did this, they said, of course we knew there were journalists in the building. Everything in Gaza is a Hamas target. And also, RT had taken a side in the coverage. RT had taken a side in the coverage. That is an explicit admission of war crimes and also a threat that if you simply cover the truth, you will be targeted and potentially killed for your journalism. So that was another eye-opening moment for me. Now, yeah, I mean, the media is just so unbelievably cartoonishly one-sided when it comes to Israel-Palestine that everything's told in the passive voice, right? Palestinians just somehow died. They were never murdered or killed. I remember during the 2014 massacre in Gaza, a missile bombed an entire cafe of people watching the World Cup, and the headline of the New York Times was "Missile Finds Cafe." Like the missile just actually had its own autonomy and found the people watching sports and then just decided to blow up. I mean, it is really beyond the pale and absolutely despicable that people can call themselves journalists and write these kind of headlines. I mean, editorialize in such a way that you are covering for these atrocities. You know, you mentioned AP or Reuters. You know, these are supposed to be like these impartial news wires that are then given to the papers that then editorialize the news. And really, it's unbelievable how one-sided they are as well. I mean, covering up for the fact that there was a settler attack that ran over 2 Palestinians, right? It's unreal. It really is unreal. And it's always For example, when people are blown up in Gaza, it's always militants. It's state stenography that's just repeated by AP and Reuters and all these other publications. And when, let's say, the soldier who just was killed at the border, well, that was just a civilian, according to the news. You see this time and again, and it doesn't matter what publication it is. It's always not only telling Palestinians that are being genocided in this passive voice where you never actually know. It's very obscure of how they're actually dying. But other than that, of course, there's absolutely no context to the situation. So it's always painted as, oh, it's just both sides of the struggle. Oh, it's just this religious conflict that's been happening for thousands of years. And I guess there's no solution to it. It's actually a very clear-cut solution. It's a very crystal clear reality. It's an oppressive colonial apartheid state that is committing genocide and ethnic cleansing against an indigenous population. And the fact that none of this context is allowed really speaks volumes, because the media is essentially an arm of the Pentagon. And you even see from the entire U.S. political establishment that the corporate media just falls in line and toes the line of whatever U.S. foreign policy is. And you have not seen a peep from Joe Biden or any of his cabinet. In fact, they're running cover for Israel. And that is why you see complete deafening silence from the U.S. political establishment, because they understand that Israel is a necessary military outpost for the U.S. empire in the Middle East. That's why it's fully protected and subsidized by U.S. taxpayer dollars to the tune of $10 million every single day. They need to protect it and shroud it with complete immunity. And that is why the BDS movement and international pressure is so crucial, especially to this government, especially as American citizens, because without pressure on our government, it's going to be very, very difficult for pressure to mount against Israel, because this government is really the main facilitator of what's going on. To first and foremost link the struggle of Palestinians to the struggle of anti-imperialism in general. And beyond that, the struggle of that a lot of liberals care about here. I mean, immigration policies. You see Israeli military technology caging immigrants at the border. The police, right? The entire Black Lives Matter movement, the militarization of police. All of our police forces, mostly all of them, are trained in Israel by Israeli police officers. You see an NYPD actually has an office in Tel Aviv. All of these things are connected, right? The increasing expansion of the military-industrial complex, the fact that every single cent is squandered to bolstering up these oppressive regimes around the world and subsidizing things like Israeli apartheid. Meanwhile, Americans are left with near nothing. I mean, we have no health care. We have no free college. People are really, really struggling during this pandemic. Those things need to be linked together. The consciousness need to be intermixed. People need to understand that all of these things can be rooted back to one source, which is this out-of-control U.S. empire that is oppressing so many people around the world. I think raising consciousness is actually the first and foremost, the most imperative thing that people can do, because Israel thrives on having the narrative in their favor. And so this is why it's so important to actually correct the record on the Palestinian behalf, because we need to show the world what's really going on, because once you see, you can't unsee the truth. And that is also, it's also imperative for American citizens to join solidarity actions in the streets, show numbers. This weekend, there's huge protests going on all over the country. We need to go out in numbers and show strength and resilience and stand with our Palestinian brothers and sisters. Beyond that, we need to join BDS movements. We need to join divestment campaigns. And we need to stand up against the increasing criminalization of this peaceful act of resistance. There's 30 states that have anti-BDS laws on the books. They are now passing laws that are criminalizing this at college levels, conflating Judaism with Zionism. And these are all just horrific things that I think just shows that Israel's running scared, the US government's running scared, and it really shows you that this kind of activism is working, because they know historically that this has worked, that it's the only thing that will bring down regimes like this. And this is why it's so crucial for us to get up, get out of our comfort zones, and link up with other activist movements, communities, Palestinian solidarity organizations, and really show up. Because it's only with numbers, and it's only building a huge anti-imperialist mass movement in this country that puts fear in the heart of our politicians, that we will actually see justice prevail.
I'm glad you brought up Hind again, because we were asking her about the media bias. And real quick, before we close here, I did want to note that I have to mention this article because it's so insane. That obviously the stuff we're talking about is a positive development, but that doesn't mean anything's really changed, because we read that New York Times quote before of like trying to balance it out, because these newspapers these corporate media outlets, they go out of their way to not offend the pro-Israel narrative. And and if that means, adding things that imply that the killing of children was justified by saying Hamas was everywhere and just repeating Israeli talking points, they'll do it. But then on the other end, you can say almost anything about Palestinians and get away with it in mainstream media. And this is a perfect example because it's so shocking. This was published yesterday in Newsweek. It's called In the Middle East, Give War a Chance, by a man named Abraham Miller. He's a distinguished fellow at the Haim Solomon Center. I'm not sure if that's it sounds like maybe it's based in Israel. I'm not entirely sure. But either way, he's at this think tank center. And he wrote in an American corporate publication, the Newsweek, and he goes on explaining why, Israel is right to do war, and sometimes you just got to give war a chance. I mean, that article title in and of itself, Give War a Chance, is psychotic. But this is what really stood out, okay? He says, an intractable enemy must be destroyed. The cost of war must be so great that Hamas will not be able to repeat its periodic foray of violence, its continual mobilization of wars of attrition. If the dog is to survive, then the fleas must be destroyed in their earliest stages. So you have somebody in a corporate mainstream publication, then you guys can see it on the screen, literally comparing Palestinians to fleas on a dog. Okay, saying that in order for the dog to survive, the fleas must be destroyed. So he's comparing Palestinians. I don't care if it's Hamas. It doesn't matter. He's comparing them to insects. He's actually kind of worse than insects, right? Like fleas are sort of like almost like parasite insects. I mean, the level of dehumanization, this is genocidal language. And I mean, do you remember when Brett Stevens lost it because somebody emailed him or tweeted, some random college student equated him with a flea because he's annoying, and he was
this is Brett Stevens from the New York Times.
Yeah, this is Brett Stevens. Yeah, the elitist columnist from the New York Times who gets paid probably an insane amount of money to just write racist drivel, and justify war crimes, and everything else right wing you can think of. But anyways, my point is to say that this guy, this kid almost got suspended for calling for just a random tweet calling this guy a flea. But and he wasn't addressing a people. He was addressing one person who's an asshole and deserved it. But in this case, you're talking about a whole group of people. You're equating them with fleas as they're being bombed and their children are being killed in a major publication. We have a long way to go. We have a very long way to go where you can use genocidal rhetoric about Palestinians, but God forbid you talk about the conflict, which a conflict is still a stupid euphemism, but talk about it in an honest way. God forbid.
I know. I mean, it's obviously it's ridiculous. And I mean, people, having written for some mainstream publications, it's not as if you can't edit op-eds. Someone could have said, "Yo, come on." Someone
edited that. Someone actually saw that and didn't think it was problematic. God, maybe it was worse. Who knows?
Yeah, maybe they thought they were standing up for some great press freedom or something like that. But
it's being described as an unconditional ceasefire, and I guess I'm a little bit skeptical about whether it's going to hold, because it makes no mention of the precipitants of what happened. That is to say, Israel is not obliged to cease its evictions of families in East Jerusalem. Israel is not obliged to make any adjustments in its policies regarding Al-Aqsa Mosque. And most important of all, so far nothing has been said about the blockade. So that's, let's call it as I said, the precipitants. Nothing is being addressed. Then there's a second level of concern, namely, Israel suffered a major defeat, and it's not about to acquiesce in that defeat. So the likelihood is it will now persist in its attempts to assassinate at least one of the top Hamas leaders in order to get a ex post facto, so to speak, victory, and a post ceasefire victory. So that also bodes badly for where things are headed. And right now, as we speak, the whole history is being rewritten. If you look in, say, today's New York Times, according to the Times, everything started with the Hamas rocket attacks on Israel. What happened in East Jerusalem has been whited out what happened in Al-Aqsa Mosque has been whited out. Everything started with the Hamas rocket attacks. And in addition, what they're dangling before the Palestinians in Gaza is, we will give you international aid to rebuild, but the quid pro quo is that Hamas has to disarm. Now, this has happened 100 times before, so there's nothing new there. But it's impossible that Hamas is going to agree to that, because that effectively means, and here I'll just use the language of the human rights organizations, that effectively means Israel can continue on the path of the forcible eviction of families from East Jerusalem. Israel can maintain its blockade of Gaza. And Hamas, in exchange for some money, is supposed to accept the system of Israeli domination of the Palestinians. And frankly, nobody has even managed to divine what fate Israel even wants for Gaza. If you ask, what's your long-term plan? What's your short-term plan for Gaza? There is none. So I don't see how a restoration of the status quo can possibly be stable. I can't imagine that Hamas is going to agree to disarm. So I can't say I'm really optimistic. The only thing I can say is we've been here many times before. The ceasefire, the promises of international aid, the promises that Israel will relax the blockade, none of it has ever happened. And it's a long history. It's not like we're starting fresh. It's a long history. None of it ever happened, so there's no reason to expect it will happen in the future. And the future is even more dim because Israel lost. It knows it lost. Their defense minister boasted today that Israel accrued many military victories. Who was going to believe that? The only military victory I could see they accrued is they killed 100 women and children. For Israel, that's a victory.
Yeah.
The more people you kill, leaving aside the male, I don't even know what percentage of the men were actually Hamas militants. But killing 100 women and children, it's an achievement for Israel. But nobody's going to really believe that they accrued military victories, so far as I can tell. And I'm not a military strategist, and I don't like to pretend to be one. But just as a factual matter, did they achieve any military victories? So let's see. They said they were going to blow up the tunnels in Gaza, and they were going to kill all the militants who were in the tunnels. That proved not to be a success. It was acknowledged it wasn't successful. They claim Iron Dome was a success. There's no evidence for that, because there's no evidence that the Hamas projectiles were actually rockets. All the evidence seems to point to the conclusion that the Hamas projectiles were just the usual fireworks. The evidence, in my opinion, is pretty clear. You might recall the first few days of the Israeli assault, the first few days, they were saying that the Iron Dome was not functioning. First they said it had malfunctioned. Then they said the Iron Dome wasn't equipped to deflect massive bursts of Hamas rockets. Okay, so let's see, what was the damage done during those first few days before Iron Dome was active? Israel didn't claim a 90% effective rate for Iron Dome until about the 7th day into the attack. Before that, it was supposedly not functioning. Well, if you look at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, there's no evidence of any significant, there's barely evidence, interestingly enough, there's barely evidence of trivial infrastructural damage. So to try to explain my point, you can claim that the reason there are so few civilian casualties in Gaza, in Israel, why there are so few civilian casualties, you can make the claim that they have a very effective civil defense system, which is true, they do. The shelters, the iPhones with messages to run to a shelter, a rocket is coming your way. So that would account for the fewness of the civilian casualties. It was about 12 civilian casualties during this past week. But obviously, houses can't go into shelters. Schools can't go into shelters. Hospitals can't go into shelters. High-rises can't go into shelters. So if the rockets were effective, now remember, they were saying, each day they were saying 400 rockets were fired, 500 rockets were fired. If they were actually rockets, there had to have been infrastructural damage. But if you look at the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs website, they keep a daily diary. They did it in 2014 as well. and I followed it every day trying to see what was the infrastructural damage. And I looked at it this time, it was actually less than in 2014, during the period when they said Iron Dome wasn't functioning. So my conclusion is there are probably very few real rockets. Maybe there were a couple of real rockets thrown in. But if you understand Gaza, it's very improbable that it was more than a handful. Gaza, as my friend put it, is the size of a postage stamp. There's intense electronic surveillance of Gaza. There's a lot of human intelligence in Gaza because there are a lot of people sympathetic to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank who act as spies for Israel. And it's hard to conceal what Israel is claiming. Israel said 4,000 rockets were fired. Now, how do you conceal 4,000 rockets in a place like Gaza? It's just, these are all very most improbable claims that are being made. So my guess is there was very little in the way of Hamas rocket attacks. How effective Iron Dome was, who knows? Last time, I think its effectiveness might have been about 30%. No reason to suppose it was higher this time. So there are no military victories. And it's plain as day to Israelis. They're not that brainwashed. And so Israel will want to settle the score, rectify the balance sheet, so to speak. And that bodes very badly for the future, I'm afraid to say. Probably they will succeed at some point in some high-level assassination, and then the troubles are going to start all over again. Yes, I think both things are possible. There has been a political sea change. Everybody knows it. The most obvious manifestation of the sea change is Israel's most stalwart allies in the U.S. government simply abandoned ship, or like rats scurrying over a ship, off a ship. And the most, I would say, the most emblematic case is Charles Schumer. Schumer prided himself when he would go before Jewish audiences. He would say, "I am the Shomer, I am the watchman for Israel." And what did the watchman do this time? He didn't utter a word. That was really shocking. And that points to some interesting things about politics. So since we've had a lot of discussions about details, but there are also, in my opinion, quite interesting broad generalizations you can make about politics from this experience. So why did Schumer remain quiet? The answer is pretty obvious. He was terrified of AOC. He saw what happened with Andrew Yang. Well, let's put in the general context. He knows she's going to run against him in the next election. It's not certain, but there's a high probability. Let's just call it high probability. Never be certain about your speculations. A high probability she's going to run against him. He saw what happened to Andrew Yang earlier in the week. Andrew Yang puts out this tweet, wholly supportive of Israel. She shoots him down. And then he's forced into the embarrassing position of having to issue a correction, more not apology, but a correction.
Barely, yeah.
So he knew that if he defended Israel the way Yang did, she was going to shoot him down. And of course, she was going to shoot him down with relish because it would be the opening salvo of the campaign to unseat and displace Schumer. So he fell silent. Secondly, so that's the power that AOC now has. With a single tweet or the potential of a single seat, she could silence the Senate Majority Leader. Quite breathtaking. As a political fact, it's quite breathtaking. Secondly, there's this thing, as we all know, called the Squad. The Squad actually showed a lot of power this time. They did not defer to Biden. They called him out directly, faced him on the tarmac in the case of
Rashida
Tlaib in Detroit. I thought that was quite interesting. Again, the power of just a few individuals in politics. Here it's AOC, a recent congresswoman, a recent addition to Washington, and she could silence Chuck Schumer, who's been in Congress probably now, must be at least 35 to 40 years. I mean, he started as a congressman in my neighborhood. But Chuck was a standout, no question about it. And it's regrettable the choices he made in life. He lusted more for power than for principles. He is a mighty force. He is a mighty force. And AOC silenced him. So
but do you think it's the power of the individual, or is it that things have shifted and she's reflecting that shift?
Totally valid point. Totally valid point. You have to sort of integrate so many factors. I'm sort of highlighting some factors, but then there is what you said, public opinion has radically shifted. And then you have to account for that fact. And that's another, a bundle of factors that you have to look at. But the bottom line is a corner has been turned. Israel has lost reflexive U.S. support for its actions. And you saw that with Biden. I'm sure in the previous interviews I did with you, my memory isn't perfect because I did many interviews in that period. But it was clear that Biden was telling Israel, there are limits. There are not going to be any large-scale massacres, and we're not bailing you out. You're out on your own. So that curbed Israel. It's no source of solace to the people who were killed. It's no source of solace to the homes that were destroyed. But I think the facts speak to Biden felt all the pressures. And there you have to engage a whole other range of factors that were bearing down on Biden. There was China. China was mocking the U.S. and the Security Council by constantly saying we have to have a ceasefire, and knowing full well Biden couldn't do it. So, and China was clearly, because China rarely takes political stands in the UN. It just cares about commerce, money, business. Doesn't really much care about politics. But it took a very strong stand. It took a stronger stand regarding the Palestinians, and they were clearly doing it because they were getting back at the U.S. for the U.S.'s stand in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. So there was China. Then there were the fears in the Middle East, across the Middle East, because there were eruptions there, that if Israel persisted on this path, it was going to unleash forces that, for now, everybody prefers are kept latent rather than blatant. So there were those dimensions, and there were the domestic dimensions for Biden, which were the squad, the open criticisms of him, and the fact that there's no love lost between Biden and Netanyahu. He's not going to go out on a limb for Netanyahu. Netanyahu thumbed his nose at the Obama administration. Frankly, he humiliated Obama, and that's because he's such a racist. It's a cliche. I think the tide has turned. I don't think it's going to go back in terms of public opinion. Their default setting, Israel, is to just torture and torment Palestinians. And in the case of Gaza, they never got beyond the default setting. They never did. If you ask, what's your plan? What's your long-term? We know what the long-term plan for the West Bank is. The West Bank is confine the Arabs to less and less space, open up more and more space for Jews, what they call settle the land, and hopefully at some point to reduce them to a tiny parcel of territory or get them to leave. That's clear. That's their goal. But in Gaza, beginning in roughly about 2003-4, the feeling was, for those of you who don't go back that far, there were 7,000 settlers in Gaza at the time, about 7,000. And there were 2 million Palestinian Gazans in Gaza. And the feeling was, we cannot win the demographic war in Gaza. It's hopeless. Gazan families are large. We can't get Jewish settlers to go there. So they decide, in the terms of their demographic battle, they're going to cut Gaza loose and just focus on the West Bank. But cutting Gaza loose did not mean letting them go their own way. First of all, let's be clear. They're not obliged to go their own way. There's one country called Palestine. You don't get to, cut off one chunk and then keep another chunk. But they didn't actually even let it go loose. They encircled it. They encircled it and confined them in a prison.
And you can't leave, right? It's like the only place in the world where you can't leave by boat.
You can't leave by anything. There's no seaport. There's no airport. They were promised many moons ago. I can't remember. One of them they actually had, and then Israel bombed. You can't leave. It's hermetically sealed. It's well, as I said, there are all sorts of terms that have been used to describe it. Everything from a toxic waste dump to an open air prison to a concentration camp. It's a pretty awful place, and it's also among the most densely populated places on Earth. I think number one, I think there are some dangers that loom for those who are trying to achieve a just settlement of the conflict. And so I'd like to just address some of the dangers that loom. Number one, a lot of people are going to walk away from what happened this past week by saying armed struggle is the only way to, quote unquote, liberate Palestine. And there will be a lot of what's the right word? There'll be a lot of people who are going to dismiss the possibility of nonviolent civil resistance, mass political action. They're going to say that Israel only understands the language of force, that the only way is armed struggle. And in part of me, I have to say, I get it. I get it, because in March 2018, Palestinians did try mass nonviolent resistance. It evoked no international sympathy, no international action. And I understand, I didn't see it, but I understand that Aaron Mate, your friend, comrade, he interviewed the international representative for Hamas. The person's name is Bassem Naim, who I happen to know, eventually correspond with. And I understand he said on the show that we've decided nonviolent civil resistance doesn't work. And I think that's going to carry over to a lot of the quote unquote Palestinian solidarity movement. And I think that will actually, it will pose an obstacle to trying to think through a reasonable way to resolve this conflict.
But at the same time, we are in the first day of the Eid holiday, and Palestinian people teach life. So, we saw an article from the New York Times today about a family that insisted on celebrating their daughter's birthday. People are still celebrating Eid in their homes. They're trying to live as normally as possible, knowing that their death can be moments away. But that is who we are as a people. And as for Israel, Israel's on a genocidal campaign. Netanyahu has talked about hitting Gaza, strikes that they have never dreamed of. He promised that this is just the beginning. I'm sure Nora and Asa, you saw that they have already leveled 4 entire residential buildings in Gaza. Those residential buildings house hundreds of families. I mean, can you imagine an entire 15-story residential building that was leveled in a manner that looks like a planned demolition? Yeah, and I mean, I think we have to ask ourselves, what do we expect people to do, and how do we expect people to react to this kind of brutality? I mean, the problem is that Palestinians have been so dehumanized for many decades that we don't even offer them the possibility of reacting the way that any human being would, right? The scenes out of Gaza right now in 2021 look like the Nakba of 1948. The people are leaving their homes with, bags of their belongings and the clothes on their back, and the kids are walking out with no shoes, and they're just trying to find anywhere to go. But of course, it's actually even worse than the Nakba of 1948, because in Gaza you have no place to go. There is no place to escape to. There is no safe zone. There is no, a no-fire zone. They can't leave Gaza because the very same entity which is pummeling them with these airstrikes is the same entity that has imposed a 15-year-long military siege on Gaza, a blockade that has basically sealed off the border, and it also a naval blockade that makes it impossible for them to even escape by sea if they wanted, right? So we're talking about caging 2 million people. These people, remember, 80% of them are refugees. These people the majority of them aren't even from Gaza. The majority of them trace their origin to the cities and villages that they were expelled from in 1948 at the time of the creation of the State of Israel. They just want to go back home. But instead of being able to go back home, which is their right, enshrined under international law, not only can they not go back home, but they must sit in Gaza, subjugated, and just at the mercy of Israel's bombs. So this is a situation that we have in Gaza. And, I have to admit that we have to always keep in mind our role in this. As the United States, we are the primary funder of Israel. Israel is the world's largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid. If there are Americans that listen to this podcast that think it's not their problem, I'm sorry to say that that's simply not the case.
Well, we've been at this for a long time. This is the sheer propaganda that we always hear, Emily. This isn't about Hamas. This is about Israel. Israel provokes. Israel commits every crime you can imagine. Israel injures more than 300 worshippers, peaceful worshippers, this morning in Al-Aqsa Mosque. Israel evicts people of their homes, continues with its sheer violations of the very basic rights of people, and then they try to blame the react rather than the act. This must stop, and we must really visit the root causes of all this, and the root cause of all this is Israel's insistence on the very denial of people's basic rights. Tonight, as we speak, Emily, people are demonstrating in Palestine all over, including cities inside the Green Light, in 48 Palestine, in Jaffa, in Haifa, in Nazareth. Why do you think people are demonstrating? They're fed up. They're fed up of their rights being denied. They're fed up of being pushed away. They're fed up of their homes being taken away.
So let's break that down bit by bit if we can. You see it very clearly. The Israelis think that Hamas are a radical terror group and that Palestinian officials use these holy times to incite violence. Was Hamas right to respond with rocket fire?
This isn't about Hamas. Hamas was not involved. There were tens of thousands.
They were when they fired rockets.
Hamas did not decide to evict people from their homes inside the occupied city of Jerusalem. East Jerusalem is occupied not according to my law only, but according to your law, according to the UK position, according to the United Nations. An occupation has to be temporary, and it has to respect the rules that govern occupation. Israel has made mockery of these rules, particularly the issue of population transfers, ethnic cleansing, apartheid. I'm sure you have read the Human Rights Report. Those people have researched Israeli policies over the last 2 years. Ask the experts, not Netanyahu. Netanyahu is flaming
of the settlements, but let's just try and understand this, because Dori Gold, the former Israeli ambassador to the UN, has told us it was pre-planned by Hamas. The march had nothing to do with it. You wanted to make Israel look bad. Do you condemn the rocket attacks by Hamas?
I condemn, and I condemn Israeli aggression. I mourn for the 20 people who were murdered in Gaza only tonight. 9 of them are children. I am so sad to see the hundreds of my people
but you know,
being...
I'm not asking about Israeli aggression. I will do that in a moment. I'm asking you about Hamas's aggression tonight.
I am not aware of any Israeli who has been killed. And you ask me a question about violence and condemnation. Who should be condemned, Emily? Who should be condemned? Did you see the images of the 9 children being dissipated in Gaza tonight? Who should be condemned? And then the UK Foreign Secretary is quick to condemn Hamas and never to condemn the Israeli atrocities on a daily basis. We are sick and tired of the double standards, and we have to call it right this time. Call a spade a spade.
Is it the Western governments? Is it? You heard the statement from Dominic Raab today. He condemned the firing of rockets. What is your response to the UK government?
Always the story begins when Palestinian reaction happens, as if it started with Hamas. Look at your question. Your question is about Hamas, rockets.
But that's because I'm talking to you.
No, Emily. I have done many interviews. It starts with the Palestinian reaction, with the symptom of the illness. It never visits the illness. The illness is that this state, Israel, the occupying state, has been applying draconian measures against our people in every sense, depriving them the right to move, the right to own their property, the right to work, the right to vote in a free elections, including in East Jerusalem, every right you can imagine, and not only by the way inside the occupied territories, but even inside Israel itself. There is a Knesset law that has deprived our people inside Israel their basic rights of having self-determination. This whole system has been built. Endemic in it is the racism, endemic in it is the vulgar ultra-nationalism. That's why you get people trying to defend their dignity. And that's why, if you see the images, don't listen to me, look at the footage. People were praying. And by the way, put aside the Aqsa Mosque, one sentence. Put aside the Aqsa Mosque. Only last week, it was the Holy Fire, Easter, and the Israeli authorities prevented Palestinian Christians.
Because you're not debating, I'm going to put you
from praying. So this isn't about Muslims. This is about Palestinians. This is about Israel insisting that we are second-class, not even citizens. We have no rights. We are ought to be brutalized with silence. And when we act with dignity, when we resist this, the whole thing becomes about our resistance and our struggle.
And I understand very much those underlying issues. Let me ask you specifically about the Al-Aqsa Mosque, because that's not something that you will debate tonight for obvious reasons. Israeli police say they believe it was being used as a military stronghold. That was why they started sending in their stun grenades. What is your response to that?
It's nonsense. It's nonsense. My response to that is ask the Red Cross, ask all the international observers there. People were going in the holiest of months, that is Ramadan, in the holiest night of Ramadan, Laylat al-Qadr, they were there to pray. If you look at the images, the Israeli soldiers stormed Al-Aqsa Mosque while they were praying, while they were kneeling and started throwing all the gas and stun grenades and what have you, brutalizing people. Look at the numbers. Look at the hundreds who have been injured. And therefore, this whole propaganda should not work. Israel is deliberately trying to flare the situation, especially politicians, right-wing extreme politicians, to dodge criminal charges that is Netanyahu facing, and to feed the populism in Israel right now and the right-wing extremists.
Yeah, I think one of the main flaws of U.S. media coverage is that it erases all the context and presents this situation at best as being like some kind of incomprehensible religious struggle between two roughly equal groups at best, but usually that Israel is the victim and the Palestinians are the aggressors. And that is a complete reversal of the reality. And I think what is starting to cut through it, I feel like never before, is just the sheer horror of the hard reality of what's happening. And over the last 10 days of the Israeli bombardment campaign on Gaza, I've been in touch almost every day with friends and colleagues there. The Electronic Intifada has wonderful reporters we work with in Gaza, and I have friends there. And these are people who've lived through 3 major Israeli attacks on Gaza since 2008, including the one in 2014 that killed more than 2,200 people, including 550 children in the space of 51 days. And they all tell me this is the worst thing they've ever been through, that they go to bed at night, although nobody sleeps right now, convinced that they're not going to survive the night. The bombing is relentless. It's like a constant earthquake that never stops. That people's greatest fear is not being bombed, but being bombed and surviving to have to mourn, the rest of their family who's been wiped out. Because they see that happening every day. Entire families have been wiped out. On early Sunday morning, Israel bombed Al-Wahda Street in Gaza City, destroying at least two residential buildings, killing almost 50 people, wiping out generations of families. One family, for example, the Al-Qawlaq family, lost more than 20 people in that one bombing attack, the youngest being 6 months old and the eldest being 84 years old. And one of the myths that is perpetrated by the media is that, Hamas, the bad guys, indiscriminately fire at civilians, whereas Israel, the good guys, do all they can to spare civilians. And that's just not true. Israel is targeting civilian homes. It's targeting high-rise apartment buildings and office buildings. It has destroyed Médecins Sans Frontières clinic. After it bombed Al-Wahda Street, it also bombed the roads from that area to Al-Shifa Hospital. So that ambulances were unable to get to people in time to rescue them. So far, it has killed 2 doctors. Dr. Ayman Abu al-Auf was killed in his home in an Israeli bombing attack with 2 of his children. He's the head of internal medicine at Al-Shifa Hospital, which is Gaza's main hospital. He was playing an essential role, not just in dealing with the more than 1,500 injuries from the current bombing attack, but also in the COVID response in Gaza, which was already catastrophic. And now you have tens of thousands of people displaced from their home. The health ministry has had to close down the COVID testing lab. People are obviously not going to get vaccinated when they're being bombed in this way. And now you have people sheltering in UNRWA schools in very poor conditions, which are just rife for another COVID catastrophe if and when this horrific bombing campaign ends. And people who never paid that much attention are starting to say, wait, Israel did what? They bombed the office of the Associated Press brazenly. They bombed the office of Al Jazeera brazenly. They're bombing everything in Gaza. And the reason for that is because there really are no military targets in Gaza. This is not a war in the classic sense. It is asymmetric warfare. Israel is trying to fight against a popular resistance movement, which is resisting military occupation and siege and colonialism. This is an anti-colonial struggle. And there's nothing for Israel to bomb into. There are no big military bases to bomb. The Palestinian resistance factions don't have warplanes sitting on the ground. They don't have columns of tanks to bomb. So Israel is implementing something called the Dahiya Doctrine, which was first implemented in 2006 in its war in Lebanon, when it basically destroyed the southern suburb of Beirut called the Dahiya. And the logic that was articulated by Israeli military strategists is that in this kind of asymmetric warfare, you have to cause such pain and agony to the civilian population, to the society at large, that people will never dare resist you again. And it has never worked. By the way, it didn't work for the United States in Vietnam, where it killed millions of people in Southeast Asia, carpet bombed them from B-52s. It didn't work for the French in Algeria, and it's not working for Israel either, because once a people has made the collective decision to free itself from colonial rule, societies tend to show that they're willing to pay an extraordinary price for that freedom and liberation.